At first, Emily laughed. "He's chasing a mouse," she said, watching Clover paw at the brick wall in the storage room. But the laughter faded on the third day when the dog refused to leave that corner, not even for bacon. That night, she asked her mom about the wall, and Meredith frowned. "I thought that part of the house was solid," she said, but it wasn't. As Emily knocked, a hollow echo rang back. Her heart skipped. That night, she dreamed of a baby's cry behind bricks. By the end of the week, Clover was sleeping in front of the wall, guarding it like a grave, and Emily wasn't laughing anymore. Before we begin this unforgettable story, would you mind sharing where you're from in the comments? And if stories of love, loyalty, and second chances move, you please give this video a like and consider subscribing. Pinebrook, Vermont. Early autumn, late afternoon light. The town of Pinebrook was steeped in golden light that October afternoon, the kind that slanted through bare branches and set the dry maple leaves aflame. The air carried a quiet chill. Not yet winter, but enough to make the breath visible and the wind bite at the cheeks, nestled just past a winding road and a half-collapsed orchard fence. The Harper house sat with its chipped white shutters and a porch swing that creaked even when no one was sitting in it. Inside, the house smelled faintly of cinnamon, old cedar, and something that lingered longer like memory. Emily Harper, 16, with loose brown hair always falling into her eyes, padded across the old wooden floors in thick socks. She was lean in a way that made people assume she ran cross-country. She didn't, and moved with the kind of grace one only earned from learning how to stay unnoticed. Her eyes, storm gray, had the habit of narrowing with thought, always watching, always measuring. Since her father passed in late spring, she'd spoken less and listened more. Grief had made her careful, not quiet, not timid, just deliberate. She was headed toward the back utility room, a space neither cozy nor practical, used mostly for extra storage, old coats, and seasonal decorations. She'd gone in looking for a roll of tape to wrap a school project. But what she found instead was Clover. Clover was a 6-year-old golden retriever with soft, cream-colored fur and a tail that never wagged without a reason. He was tall for his breed, with wise, honey-colored eyes that seemed to see more than most. Found abandoned behind a gas station 2 years prior, Clover had been rescued by the Harper family after a vet tech friend of Meredith's Emily's mother called in a favor. He had scars on his hind leg and an old chip in one ear, as if life had knocked him around once and he'd decided to remember it. Yet he carried himself with a noble calm, loyal without being needy, affectionate without demanding. Clover rarely barked, but when he acted, it was with purpose. Now. Clover was staring at the far end of the room, his body rigid, one paw lifted, pressed against the exposed brick wall like he expected it to move. His claws scraped lightly, again and again, a steady sound against the mortar. Scritch. Pause. Scritch. Emily froze in the doorway. "Clover," she asked, cautious but amused. "You chasing ghosts now?" Clover didn't look back. He pawed again, then let out a low, brief whine. Emily stepped closer, brows furrowed. The wall in question was old original to the house, she guessed. Probably 1920s. The brick had been painted over at least twice, once in a dingy cream, then in a strange pale blue that had started to peel in long, curling strips. It was cold to the touch, nothing unusual, and yet Clover kept going. She crouched beside him. "What is it? Boy, mouse, spider? Or are we doing Scooby-Doo today?" Clover's ears twitched at her voice, but his gaze didn't shift. He tapped the wall again, precisely at one brick near the center, like he knew something was beneath it. Emily pressed her palm flat where he indicated, solid, but cold, colder than the surrounding wall. Maybe there was a draft behind her. The worn wooden floor creaked as Meredith Harper approached. Meredith was in her early 40s, tall and narrow-shouldered, with a frame built from long hours in the bakery downtown. Her hair, once copper red, had settled into a softer auburn, often tied in a fraying scarf to keep flour out of it. Her face bore the gentle fatigue of someone who smiled through most things, even grief, even loneliness, after her husband's accident. She'd poured herself into her work and into Emily. She was fair, kind, but weathered like wood that had held up through years of rain. "Everything okay?" she asked, wiping her hands on a flower-streaked apron. "Clover's found something," Emily replied, still staring at the wall. "He's been scratching it since I got here. Really locked on it." Meredith stepped closer, glanced at the wall, then at the dog. "Probably mice," she offered, her tone practical but not dismissive. "Maybe," Emily said slowly, standing up, "but I don't think so." That night, she lay awake, staring at the cracks in her bedroom ceiling. The image of Clover's unwavering stare burned into her mind. She kept hearing that sound scritch like something trying to be heard through years of silence. At midnight, she padded barefoot down the stairs and into the back room. Clover was already there. He turned as she entered, then returned to the same brick, tapping it once more. Just once. Then he sat. Emily knelt beside him again, her breath frosting faintly in the room's chill. "Okay," she whispered, "you win." The next morning, the clouds hung low over Pine Brook, casting a soft silver gloom across the slanted rooftops and the maple-lined streets. The Harper home, old and weathered, creaked in quiet places as if stretching its bones. In the back room, where yesterday's dust still lingered in corners, Emily stood holding the crowbar again, her pulse quick and light with the weight of what they were about to disturb. Clover sat at her side, calm and alert, his tail brushing the floor with a slow rhythm. Meredith Harper entered the room silently, still in her knit sweater from the bakery's early morning shift, her auburn hair pulled into a messy bun. A fine line of flour dusted her shoulder, and her eyes were darker than usual, not from tiredness, but from a focus that only came when she sensed something meaningful was about to happen. "Let's do this before I lose my nerve," she said, managing a half smile. Emily nodded and wedged the crowbar behind the loose brick, wincing slightly as it scraped and popped free, one by one. The bricks came away, revealing an uneven wooden panel behind them. Meredith leaned in, tapping the surface lightly with her knuckles. "That's hollow," she said. "Help me lift." They pried the panel loose together, revealing a cavity no deeper than a foot, with layers of dust clinging like frost. Inside sat a box metal, rectangular, and worn from time. The paint had peeled nearly clean off, and the rusted hinges protested when Meredith carefully pulled it free. They brought it to the kitchen table, laying it on a folded tea towel as if to preserve its dignity. Clover followed, settling by Emily's chair, head on his paws but eyes wide open. Meredith hesitated for a moment, then unclasped the latch. The lid creaked. Inside, time waited. Atop everything lay a baby's fabric bow, faded pink, soft but frayed at the edges. Underneath were photographs, black and white, some curled, others stiff with age, below them. A bundle of letters tied with ivory ribbon, and nestled at the very bottom, partially torn but unmistakable, was a birth certificate. Emily reached for the paper gently, unfolding it with care. It was fragile. Some parts were smudged, but one name was clear, printed beneath the heading for Mother Eleanor Wells. Emily frowned. "I've never heard of her." Meredith shook her head slowly. "Me neither. Not from Grandma. Not from Dad." Emily began to lay out the photographs. One showed a woman in her late 20s, dark hair pinned back, slender with a hesitant smile and an elegant poise. There was something in her expression, kindness, maybe sadness, that held the gaze. In another image, she stood beside a man in uniform. Emily's breath caught. She leaned closer. The man in the photo had a square jaw, dark hair combed to one side, and a familiar crooked smile. His arm was around Eleanor's shoulder. He wasn't just anyone. It was Sam Harper, Emily's grandfather. Meredith sat down hard in the nearest chair, one hand gripping the edge of the table. That's Dad," she whispered, "but this doesn't make sense." They sat in silence as the wind stirred outside, branches scraping the window gently. In the quiet, Clover shifted closer, resting his chin on Emily's foot. He didn't bark. He didn't whine. He simply stayed, as if anchoring the moment. It had been 3 days since Emily and her mother found the hidden box behind the wall. The air in Pine Brook had turned colder. the kind that bit at your knuckles and made the porch boards groan beneath your feet. The trees had begun shedding in earnest now, their bare limbs scratching at the gray sky like fingers reaching for something lost. The Harper house felt heavier somehow, not in a suffocating way, but in a way that made each room seem filled with old breath. The box now sat on the sideboard in the dining room, its contents sorted but untouched since they had last opened it. Meredith hadn't spoken much. She baked more. Loaves of sourdough and banana bread lined the kitchen counter in a rhythm that didn't need conversation. Emily spent most of her time near Clover, who had taken to sleeping under the table, his chin always turned toward the sideboard. As if guarding it, he seemed content, but alert like his job wasn't done yet. It was Saturday morning when it happened. The wind had settled, and the first light snow of the season drifted lazily past the window panes, settling along the garden's edge in thin white strokes. Emily was curled on the couch with a blanket and a book she wasn't really reading when the doorbell rang. Clover barked once a deep, grounded sound and trotted to the front door. Then he stopped, tail still, ears forward. Meredith wiped her hands on a kitchen towel and followed, calling, coming as she passed the hallway. Emily stood and moved beside her, instinctively reaching down to rest her hand on Clover's back. He didn't growl, instead. As the knob turned and the door creaked open, he wagged his tail once low and steady, and sat neatly at the stranger's feet. The man on the porch was in his late 70s, maybe early 80s, though his shoulders were still square beneath a thick brown wool coat. His white hair was thin, slicked back with care, and he wore a green plaid scarf tucked under his collar. His face was deeply lined, but not unkind. His eyes were a soft, quiet blue, the kind that carried stories, not judgment. "Excuse me," he said with a voice roughened by age but still clear. "I'm sorry to intrude. My name is Howard Green. I believe I used to know someone who lived here. A long time ago." Meredith blinked, still holding the doorknob. "Eleanor." The man smiled faintly. "A little sad. Yes. Eleanor Wells. I lived 2 doors down back in the 50s. I heard someone was asking questions about her, through the library archive. Actually, Miss Lindstrom thought you might want to meet someone who remembered her." Meredith stepped back without a word and gestured him inside. Clover rose and followed closely behind, brushing his side gently against the man's leg as if greeting an old friend. Emily watched him curiously. Clover doesn't usually act like that with strangers. Howard glanced down at the dog, then back at Emily. "He's not a stranger to the truth," he said simply, then added, "It's a comfort, I suppose." They gathered in the living room, the snow tapping lightly at the windows behind them. Howard removed his coat and folded it carefully, laying it across his lap. Underneath, he wore a burgundy cardigan and a shirt buttoned to the neck, the top button missing. Howard's hands were large and veined, and when he spoke, he often paused to look somewhere just past the room, as if recalling something stored far too long in an attic of memory. "She moved into this house in the spring of 1952, he began, voice steady. "She rented it from a cousin, if I remember correctly. Came from a bigger town south of here. Kept to herself mostly, but kind, always kind. She had a way of looking at people that made you stop talking nonsense." He chuckled softly, then continued. "She had a daughter, a baby girl, though she never talked about the father. She'd take her on walks in the morning, bundled in this yellow blanket. Sometimes she'd stop by my mother's porch and sit for a while. She liked silence." Emily leaned forward slightly. "Do you know who the father was?" Howard looked at her for a long moment before answering. "I didn't at the time, but I came to suspect he was a firefighter." "Wasn't he?" Meredith nodded slowly. "Sam Harper, my father." Howard closed his eyes briefly. He used to visit, not often, but he did, and only at night. People didn't notice, or maybe didn't care. But I did, not because I was nosy, just observant. Eleanor was different after he left for the last time. Quieter. She stopped singing. He reached into the pocket of his coat and pulled out a folded piece of yellowed paper. "I found this in a book Eleanor gave my mother, years after she moved away. It was pressed between the pages. I kept it. I never knew why." He handed it to Meredith. She unfolded it carefully. The note was written in a looping hand, and the ink had faded, but the words were clear. If someone ever finds this, if you're reading these words, then you've already seen what I left behind. I didn't want to hide the truth. I wanted to protect it until someone was ready to carry it. Sam was brave, but not free. I was free, but not brave enough. Forgive us both. Underneath was a name signed in softer ink, Eleanor. They read it in silence, after a moment. Howard stood, brushing off imaginary dust from his trousers. That's all I have. But I thought you should have it. You've earned it. Clover stood beside him again, tail brushing gently against the edge of the couch. Howard reached down and scratched behind his ear. You've got a good one here, he murmured. Meredith walked him to the door. Thank you, she said quietly. He paused before stepping back into the snow. Eleanor used to hum a song under her breath, something from a record she played. I never learned the words, but I still remember the melody. And then he was gone. The house seemed even quieter after his footsteps faded. Emily sat with the letter in her hands. Clover laid his head in her lap. We're not done, she whispered, fingers in his fur. The wind in Pine Brook that Sunday carried a kind of hush, as though even the weather knew something sacred was about to be unearthed. The sun filtered gently through the thinning clouds, casting soft beams across the backyard of the Harper home, at the far edge of the property. Just before the land dipped into bramble and pine, stood the old maple tree. Its leaves had all but fallen, save for a few golden ones clinging to the high branches, trembling like old memories. Emily stood at the back step, fingers buried in her jacket sleeves, eyes fixed on the tree. Clover stood beside her, motionless, except for the slow swish of his tail, behind them. Meredith Harper stepped out of the kitchen, holding a worn envelope, the one Howard Green had delivered just days earlier, the one that had revealed not only the existence of Lucy, but something far more intimate where Eleanor had buried her. She said, "Beneath the tree that turned gold before all others," Meredith said, her voice a little rough. "It has to be that one." Emily nodded and led the way across the damp grass. The ground was soft from yesterday's brief thaw, and the air smelled like turned soil and wood smoke. The maple towered over them like a quiet sentinel, its roots thick and sprawling, at the base. The trunk curved gently inward, creating a hollow where the ground had sunk just slightly over the years. Emily dropped to her knees beside it, brushing aside old leaves with her sleeves. She dug carefully, slowly, with her hands, until her fingertips struck something hard beneath the earth. A tin box, about the size of a lunchbox. The hinges were rusted, the paint chipped away, but it was intact. Emily pulled it free and set it on her lap, as Meredith crouched beside her. Clover lay down in the dirt, head resting near Emily's leg, as if to ground them. Emily unclasped the latch. Inside, wrapped in an old yellowed handkerchief, was a black and white photograph stiff with time, edges curled, but still remarkably well preserved. The image showed a young woman holding a baby girl, no more than a few months old. The woman was unmistakably Eleanor Wells, her expression a blend of exhaustion and radiant tenderness. The baby Lucy was swaddled in a soft, patterned blanket, eyes half closed. Next to them, on the ground near Eleanor's feet, sat a golden retriever, tail curled, watching them. On the back of the photograph, written in careful, rounded script, were the words, "Her name was Lucy. I buried her here. No one ever knew, but she was loved." Emily stared at the photo, her throat tightening. Meredith, kneeling beside her, read the note aloud once, then closed her eyes. "She never had a grave," she said softly. "No one mourned her. No one said her name," Emily whispered. "We will now." They didn't speak for a long time. Clover nudged the edge of the photograph gently, then lay still again, as if he, too, understood the weight of what had been found. Later that afternoon, they returned to the tree with a small wooden frame, into which they placed a scanned copy of the photo. Emily painted a smooth river stone with the name Lucy in white letters, simple and clean. They tucked it into the earth where they had found the box and added a few fresh wildflowers, the last of the season, to a mason jar, placing it gently beside the frame. No marble, no chiseled dates, just a name, a face, and a place to remember. "This is her resting place," Meredith said quietly, her eyes misted but steady. "And now it's her memorial." Emily replied. They stood in silence, mother and daughter, the golden dog between them. Clover sat and raised his head, watching the wind rustle the bare branches overhead. He let out one soft breath and rested again beside the stone, as if keeping watch. That night, back inside the house, Meredith lit a candle on the kitchen windowsill and left the photo's copy out on the table, illuminated by its flame. Emily tucked the original back into the tin and placed it on the sideboard, beside the first box they had found, and for the first time in decades, Lucy, the daughter hidden from the world, was home again. The snow had begun to melt in Pine Brook, leaving streaks of brown earth and damp patches of moss along the sidewalks. It was early March, and the town was inching toward spring like a cautious child stepping onto an unfamiliar path. The maple tree behind the Harper home still stood tall, bare against the pale sky. But something had changed, not in the tree, not in the yard, but in the people who lived there. Emily Harper sat cross-legged on her bed, a leather-bound journal resting against her knees. Her hair was a messy crown of curls pinned with a pencil, and her glasses slid down her nose as she wrote. The pages before her were filled with neat, sloping script, each line recording a memory, a discovery, or a question. On the cover, embossed in silver ink, were the words, "The Story Behind the Brick Wall," by Emily Harper. Writing had once been her solace, a quiet world she could enter when the noise of grief grew too loud. But ever since her father's sudden death 2 years ago, Emily hadn't written a word. His absence had left a hollow too deep to fill with language. Until now. It had started with a sound, a scratching, persistent sound behind the storage room wall. Then Clover, her golden retriever with warm amber eyes and a coat like sun-drenched hay, had led her to the truth. What they found behind those bricks had opened more than just a hidden space in the wall. It had opened a passage into the past, into the tangled roots of her family, and into her own heart. Clover lay on the floor beside her now, head resting on his paws, eyes half closed. He had changed too. No longer did he paw endlessly at the baseboards or stare at invisible ghosts. He had taken to resting under the maple tree in the afternoons, nose twitching gently in the wind, like a sentry standing silent over the memory of Lucy Wells. Downstairs, Meredith Harper moved through the kitchen with slow grace. A tall woman with narrow shoulders and long fingers. She carried a tray of lemon scones, Emily's favorite, to the dining table. Meredith had aged in subtle ways since the discovery, more silver in her bun, more pauses in her speech, but also more warmth behind her eyes. For years, she had wrapped her grief in silence, raising Emily with strength but not softness. The truth about her father's father, Sam, and the lost child Lucy had changed her too, as if by learning what was hidden. She had been allowed to grieve what she never knew she'd lost. At precisely 4 p.m., Meredith called up the stairs. "Emily!" It's time. Emily placed her journal carefully on the windowsill and came down, clutching a tote bag to her side. Inside was a printed version of the first chapter she planned to read aloud. The Pine Brook Library was hosting its annual Community Story Circle, a tradition in this town, but this time there was a twist. They were also honoring stories tied to local history. The library sat near the town square, a modest red brick building with ivy crawling up its left side and a copper bell that chimed on the hour. The event was being held in the community room, a warmly lit space with folding chairs, a podium, and a quilt hung along the back wall depicting Pine Brook's past. Clover, freshly brushed and wearing a red bandana, walked obediently beside Emily, drawing curious glances and affectionate pats from neighbors. Among those gathered was Mrs. Vera Clay, a retired teacher in her late 70s with a sharp chin and softer eyes than people expected. She had taught both Meredith and, decades earlier, Sam. She wore a sky-blue cardigan and held a mug of tea in both hands as though it warmed more than just her fingers. "I remember Sam," she whispered to Meredith. "He always stayed late to help clean the chalkboards. Quiet soul. I never imagined all this." A man named Wesley Brooks, the town's unofficial historian and bookstore owner, introduced the event. He was lanky, with glasses that never quite stayed straight and a habit of pushing his sleeves up too high. Today, we celebrate the stories that were nearly lost, he announced, and the people and animals who helped us find them again. Emily was the second reader. She stepped up to the podium, unfolding her paper, and paused. Clover sat just to her left, tail curled neatly. Emily's voice trembled only slightly as she began to read about the brick wall, the scratching, the hidden box, and the names forgotten by time, as she spoke of Eleanor, of Lucy, of a child buried beneath a maple tree without a name. The room fell into reverent silence. By the time she reached the final lines, the part where she and her mother built a quiet memorial in the backyard, a few in the audience were wiping their eyes. And when she sat down, Clover stood, stretched, and then calmly walked to the front of the room, sitting beside the podium. His gaze swept the crowd once, then settled back on Emily. Laughter broke the silence, warm, knowing. Later that evening, Wesley Brooks took the stage again. He cleared his throat and adjusted his collar. Before we close, the Pine Brook Historical Society has one more item to present. This year, for the first time, we'd like to recognize an unexpected contributor to our town's legacy. He turned toward Clover for his role in uncovering a long-forgotten chapter of Pine Brook's past, and for reminding us all that sometimes the smallest signs lead to the biggest truths we proudly honor. Clover, with the title, "The Dog Who Guarded Our History." A small ribbon was placed gently around Clover's neck, and the audience burst into applause. Clover barked once sharp, bright, like punctuation, and wagged his tail with pleased confusion. Emily grinned, eyes sparkling. She knew Clover didn't need a title or a ribbon. He had done what no one else could. He had scratched until the silence gave way to truth. He had stood watch while old griefs found daylight. He had guarded memories buried under dirt and shame. And now, as spring approached, and the wind carried new scents across old trees, it was time for a new chapter for Emily, for Meredith, for Pine Brook, and for the golden dog who had always known where the past was hiding. Sometimes, miracles don't arrive with thunder or lightning. Sometimes, they come in the shape of a golden dog scratching at a forgotten wall, or in a faded photo buried beneath an old maple tree. In this story, we saw how truth, love, and memory endured through silence, hidden letters, and the soft gaze of a loyal animal. But above all, we were reminded that God works in quiet ways, gently guiding us to what we need, whether it's healing, understanding, or a place to grieve what was lost. Perhaps the real miracle was not just discovering Lucy's name, but discovering that love never really dies. It waits, like Clover beneath the tree, watching, guarding, and hoping to be seen again. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to reflect on what forgotten truths or silent memories might be waiting in your own life, and know that God sees them all. Leave a comment with Amen if you believe that even the smallest voice or hidden memory can be used by God for something greater. Share this story with someone who needs hope today. And don't forget to subscribe for more true stories of healing, faith, and the quiet ways God speaks. May God bless you and your family today and always.